It's about a time when one single nation was, without a doubt, the center of the world's economy, holding nearly a quarter of all global wealth. And it's about how, bit by bit, that incredible fortune was systematically drained away. Let's get into it.
First things first, you gotta forget the images of poverty that often come to mind when we think about India's more recent history. For centuries, literally centuries, the story was the complete opposite. When travelers and merchants talked about India, they weren't using words like pity or charity. No, they spoke with awe, describing a land of just unimaginable riches and sophistication.
And look, this awe wasn't just based on some flowery traveler's tales. It was a hard, cold economic reality. In the early 1700s, India's share of the entire world economy was 24.4%. Let that sink in. That means that for every 4 coins, dollars, pounds, whatever, produced anywhere in the world, one of them came from India. It was a true global powerhouse.
So the big question is, how? How did India become this economic engine? Well, this massive wealth wasn't some kind of fluke or short-lived golden age. Nope. It was the result of thousands of years of sustained, organized productivity, built on a foundation that was just centuries ahead of its time.
You see, the source of all this wealth wasn't just one thing. It was this incredibly diverse and sophisticated economic ecosystem. India wasn't just digging stuff out of the ground and selling it. It was a global manufacturing hub. We're talking high-value finished goods. Its textiles were legendary. I mean, so fine they were sometimes called woven air. The steel was so advanced it was used to forge the famous Damascus swords. They were even major shipbuilders, making vessels that European traders themselves wanted to buy. On top of that, you had this insane global demand for luxury goods, spices, silks, precious gems. And it wasn't just about physical goods. India was a center for knowledge, with ancient universities that were pioneers in math, astronomy, and medicine. The whole shebang was held together by these complex trade networks and a system of production that had been perfected over centuries.
And this is not a new thing, not at all. We have records from the ancient Roman Empire where politicians were complaining, literally complaining, that the Roman thirst for Indian luxuries was draining their treasury. All their gold was flowing east and it wasn't coming back. Just think about that. That one complaint is all the proof you need of India's incredible economic pull long before the British ever showed up.
But then, things started to change. And this change, it didn't come with a giant invasion or a big declaration of war. It came quietly. It was disguised as commerce, arriving on ships that were just asking for permission to trade. And this quiet arrival, well, it would change everything.
For centuries, European powers had been desperate to get a direct piece of India's riches. As you can see here, the Portuguese got there first in the early 1500s. Then came the Dutch, then the French. They were all competitors, right? All scrambling for a slice of the incredibly profitable Indian trade. Then, in 1600, a new player enters the game, the British East India Company. And at first, they were just one company among many. But their methods would prove to be fundamentally and devastatingly different.
Now this is the absolute key to understanding what happens next. The East India Company was not the British government. It was a private, for-profit corporation. Its duty was to its shareholders. Its mission wasn't empire, it was profit, plain and simple. Yeah, the British Crown gave it a monopoly, but its actions were all driven by the bottom line. You have to remember that.
So the company's strategy for taking control, well, it was brilliant in how subtle it was. They didn't show up with conquering armies. Step 1, they came as humble traders, respectfully asking the powerful Magha emperors for permission to set up shop. But the Mughal Empire, which had kept India unified for centuries, was starting to crack. That brings us to step 2, exploit the rivalries. The company saw this political chaos as a huge opportunity. They started playing regional rulers against each other, offering their private armies and modern weapons in exchange for trading rights and political favors. And then came the masterstroke. Step 3, they got the right to collect taxes. The moment a private company gets the state's power to tax its own people, the game is over. The East India Company wasn't a trading partner anymore. It had become a government.
And this is where the story really turns. This is where we start to see the mechanics of what economists now call the great drain of wealth. Because once the company could tax the land, it started rewriting all the economic rules of the subcontinent to benefit one group and one group only, its shareholders, thousands of miles away in London.
This slide just lays it out perfectly. The great economic reversal. Look at the before column. India was an exporter of high-value finished goods. It was a global manufacturing hub. Wealth stayed in India, funding art, science, and beautiful architecture. Now look at the after column. India was turned into a supplier of cheap raw materials, like raw cotton,
That cotton was then shipped to Britain, turned into cloth in the new factories of the Industrial Revolution, and then shipped back and sold to Indians. India went from being the world's workshop to being a captive market. And the result? Wealth, which had once circulated and grown inside India, now flowed in a steady, one-way stream, straight to Britain.
And the result of these policies, I mean, when you see it on a chart like this, it is just staggering. From almost a quarter of the world's entire economy in 1700, India's share just collapses to less than 4% by the time it gets its independence in 1947. This wasn't some market downturn. This was a deliberate structural dismantling.
Okay, so a common comeback you'll hear is, yeah, but didn't the British build infrastructure like the railways? And hey, it's true, they did. But you have to ask the most important question. Who was this infrastructure built for? The railway lines were designed to solve one big problem. How do we get raw materials from the inside of the country, from the mines, the plantations, the farms, to the coastal ports as fast as possible? From there, it could all be loaded onto ships and sent to Britain. These railways were not built to connect Indian towns or to create a booming internal market for Indian goods. It was infrastructure for one purpose and one purpose only: extraction.
And this whole economic story had a devastating human cost. India's world-famous textile industry, it was crushed by taxes that made it impossible to compete. Entire families of skilled weavers who had passed down their craft for generations lost everything. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops like indigo and cotton for export, instead of the rice and wheat their own communities needed to eat. All the traditional systems that societies have to protect themselves in hard times, they just fell apart. This quote just captures the brutal, cold logic of the time. During the horrific famines that swept through India in the 18th and 19th centuries, it wasn't always because there was no food. The food existed. But under this new system, it was more profitable to export that grain than to feed the starving people right there. So millions starved, even while ships full of food sailed away from Indian ports.
Which brings us to a really tough question we have to ask ourselves. Sure, droughts happen, that's nature. But were these famines a natural disaster, or were they a disaster of policy? When you have a system that systematically removes a society's ability to feed itself and survive a shock, the catastrophe that follows, that's not just an act of God anymore.
So, this drain of wealth didn't just magically stop in 1947 when India finally got its independence. No way. The economic and the psychological damage was deep, and it would shape the nation's future for decades to come.
So what did India look like in 1947? It was dire. Economically, after 2 centuries of being deindustrialized, its industries were incredibly weak, with almost no capital to rebuild. Institutionally, the entire government, the bureaucracy, the police, it had all been designed not to serve the Indian people, but to control them for Britain's benefit. And socially, the devastating partition of the country that came with independence literally tore the subcontinent apart, creating millions of refugees and severing ancient economic ties overnight. I mean, what a starting point for a brand new nation.
But maybe the most damaging legacy of all was psychological. For generations, people grew up under a system that told them India was poor, that it was chaotic, that it was incapable of governing itself. The memory of its own prosperous past was basically erased, and it was replaced with a new story, that its poverty was ancient, that this was just how things had always been. And that's why correcting the record is so important. The myth says that India's poverty is ancient. The reality is that mass poverty is a pretty recent thing. The myth says its underdevelopment was just destiny. The reality is that it was the result of policy, of systematic extraction. So this isn't a story of some eternal decline. It's a story of incredible prosperity, followed by a period of devastating extraction, and now a long, difficult road to recovery.
And that leaves us with this final really important question. A nation's identity, its confidence, its vision for the future, it's all tied up in the story it tells itself about its past. So what happens, not just for India, but for how all of us understand history, when a record this huge is finally corrected? What new possibilities open up when a nation can remember that its potential isn't defined by a few centuries of struggle, but by millennia of strength and innovation?